Hey, everybody, welcome back. This is Sick Talks number 70. I'm here with Ted Barrow today. Ted is best known recently for the Thrasher series, This Old Ledge, which we'll talk about in a minute. But before that was, you know, internet famous or Instagram famous anyway for his Feedback TS series on the long running and much beloved, maybe much hated too. We'll see what the you know general consensus is. But beyond that, also is just somebody who I've known for a long time. I first I, I guess became aware of Ted probably in the winter of 2002 at Dietz projects at Skate the Bowl, the skateboard and post graffiti art show that featured one of the big first installations of the bowls. Ted, help me with the architect. Do you remember the architects?
Yeah, they're called Simp Arc.
Simp Arc's one of their first executed bowls, which are now famous for being in Supreme stores all over the world, among other things. But Ted, that was a very chaotic skate environment where it was every man for himself. It was what you'd call a snake session. It was hard to get a run in. And Ted, I just remember Ted standing out for a couple of reasons. And one is that A, he skated really well, and B, he looked great. And not to throw too many aesthetic compliments your way, Ted, but I would say I've always just thought of you as somebody who had aesthetics as a primary, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a second. But anyway, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to see you again, Ben.
Nice to see you too. Well, let's bring that up for a second. You have also struck me as a little bit of a I don't know what, like an interesting case, because on the one hand, you are steeped in the vernacular and the community of skateboarding, but also, if I'm not mistaken, you've got advanced graduate degrees in art history and potentially in other subjects. You are an academic, at least you have been, as well as just somebody who is not afraid to put, let's call it, provocative opinions out there, not in a obnoxious way, but in one that I think stokes debate and gets people going. How did you find yourself in the place where you are?
You mean, how do I kind of balance those two sides of my brain or something?
Well, or alternately, like, I always wanted to be an academic, but skateboarding kept calling me, or I wanted to be a pro skater, but architecture rang out.
Oh, well, I think I felt a lot of pressure to perform well in high school, but I think that was more just a unhealthy conformative impulse. Like, I wanted to kind of be like the other students, and since I didn't go to school with a lot of skateboarders, I wanted to at least like be on a level playing field as a student, like someone who studied and understood what the lessons were. And that caused me a lot of stress, and I was a terrible student. And so I spent a lot more time skateboarding and exploring downtown Austin, where I grew up, as a form of like release. And maybe looking back on it, I'm sure I wouldn't have put in those terms in my teens, but as a way of kind of learning a different type of mastery, I guess, like learning tricks, learning to emulate tricks, and learning to make those tricks my own at the spots that I found. So I think in college, when I started to study art history, that was already kind of hardwired into my brain. And when my studies became more rewarding because I really enjoyed the subject of art history, I was also going to school in LA. So there was this very intense and really exciting skateboarding scene happening there.
Yeah. Of course.
And I think, to fast forward to like the Dietz session, the bowl season, that's just a perfect fusion of my interest in art and my growing awareness of the contemporary scene and the 90s scene in New York, the alleged guys and the mostly guys, but the alleged artists and the that whole scene was fusing really well with being able to skate that bowl, and also it was winter. You needed to skate a place. I think that was...
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. So I prior to graduate school, I did kind of move to New York in order to explore the art world. And Dietz felt like a very good place to do that. I'm so grateful for the people who put that show on.
Yeah, I mean, it really was a landmark for many reasons, but not least of which the openness of it to participation. Right, it felt like I think one of the things. So I grew up skating at literally in the shadow of a museum in Syracuse, the Riverside, and so art was always super present, both in terms of on the boards and in the environment and so on and so forth. But but the Everson was similar to Dietz in that it was like it made the space available to us in a way that most other spaces didn't at the time. And I thought that was, it was obviously really important to how we all grew up. But so coming to New York to explore contemporary art, that's about like taking a art history degree and finding a job with it, or that's about coming for continuing studies, or just being among the people.
Yeah, it was kind of just being among the people. When I finished college in LA, I was working and living in Echo Park. And Echo Park had a kind of filmmaking and a music scene, and I'm sure there were visual artists and stuff, but they weren't in my world. It was like I was hanging out with a different flavor of hipster. and I sort of realized that there was probably this equivalent of people who are into visual art, photographers and painters and sculptors and stuff like that in New York City, and that maybe I should just kind of follow my nose and see what was there. I also knew that there were just really, really good museums. Not that there weren't in LA, but it just seemed like I wanted a more of a European style city, one where you didn't need a car, one where you could skate around and kind of link up with people. And that had been my experience in New York on visits in the past. So that's why I went out, but I didn't really have any plan to go to school. I just kind of wanted to, I knew I had a few years of working shitty jobs and having a lot of energy ahead of me. So I could kind of, I had time to explore. I had the luxury to explore in my mid to late 20s.
I got it. And did you, so one of the things that I think in the feedback era on Instagram, you and by the way, I have to give you credit as a tagline, nothing if not critical is just, I mean, that's like, as someone who works in the advertising universe, it's succinct, it's perfect, it says what it needs to do, it pokes in exactly the right way. It's fucking genius. And I'm very pleased now that my 17-year-old has inherited my feedback shirt and wears it to school all the time.
Oh, nice.
yeah, exactly. But in any case, in the feedback era, you really, I think, stepped into a role that was actively critical and critical in this in from the standpoint of not like harshly critical or necessarily so, but rather from a position of taking academic criticism and applying it to something. Now, you did it with a tongue in cheek, I would say, and some of it was a little harsh, which is part of the fun. But like, did you have you always been that guy? Have you always been?
No, definitely not.
The one to sort of.
I mean, we all grew up. Sorry, did you
froze?
Can you hear me? Okay,
on a stylistic level in that fashion.
Can you repeat the last bit of the question?
I can. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
Well, I was curious, like when that critical mode sort of set in, and whether you were always the guy who was like most acutely aware of those things, or whether it came later or at some point.
It came later. I was pretty, I've been able to enjoy skateboarding in a state of willful naivete. Like I'm generally pretty grateful and happy with skateboarding if I'm by myself. But as I got older, and I would say like in my early 20s, when I was in college, I was hanging out with different skaters around LA, skaters from the East Coast. And I noticed that they were critical about skateboarding in this very different way than I was. And so that was part of it. You get, like towards the end of my tenure in LA, I was hanging out with all these West Side skaters around Hot Rod Skate Shop. And They were all very on the periphery of like, serious sponsorship with really elite companies. And so the criteria for how we judged a skateboarder was really became more and more refined. And I'm not saying that I led that wave of critique, but I was privy to it and I was thinking about it. And I was thinking about how, in your mid-20s, you just have a little more mastery and you know a lot more, and you can more clearly incise the boundaries of how you feel about skateboarding. And that really came to a sharp point in the first couple of years of living in New York. I was skating with this guy, Aaron Zott, and he was really close with Bobby Pulio. And they had such an incredible, like an undeniably strong argument for one style of skateboarding against all other types of skateboarding. And I could not skate like either of those guys, but I would marvel at how articulate and forceful and well thought out and logical their critiques were. So, if anything, and then after about age 28, I kind of stopped caring about skateboarding in the same way, because I was just like, dude, I have so many other things, or not that many other things, but I have a few other things that I should start paying attention to. And so when I started doing feedback, I mean, I always skated, and I always sort of looked at skateboarding and talked about skating with my friends, but I was not trying to make a point that we should be more critical. Nothing if not critical is the title of a book of essays by the reactionary art critic Robert Hughes. And it was like a tongue-in-cheek kind of like reference to like how absurd it is to be critical in skateboarding and to publicize your thoughts on how skateboarding should be. But so in a way, I was just returning to this mode of like talking shit about a skate video in the back of a skate shop, that you do when you're just old enough to know better, that this really doesn't matter. It was kind of that.
Right. Well, and also that you that mode where you're flexing your own sort of, domain experience, domain knowledge over anybody else who is slightly less experienced than you are. It's an interesting impulse. And it's also interesting that it's Hot Rod in particular. I mean, Hot Rod, like, famously the Jonah Hill's famous homage to Hot Rod in mid-90s, and then obviously the LA courthouse being right near their, accidental location of so much epochal skating from the early 90s on. Gerhard Stoeckel moved from Germany to, be right there around that time, and talks endlessly about it. So it's really interesting. And it's funny because to me, like, I went to college in Philadelphia in 94. So the high Love Park days, Sub-Zero. I met Stevie when he was 12, it's like that kind of stuff. And it's funny how you describe it. For me, getting to Philly and listening to like the Sub-Zero guys, like listening to Ricky talk about how there was a guy named I can't think of Damien Smith. There's a guy named Damien Smith who was on Sub-Zero, and everybody hated on Damien because he wasn't as like obviously talented as Ricky or Matt Reason or Serge Straganowski or trying to think who the fifth guy on the team was at that time.
Let's see.
It's Fred Gall.
Fred Gall.
It was Fred Gall. And but listening to Ricky talk about him, he was just like, he skates all the time. He skates continuously. Damien just skated lines constantly. And I had never thought about it in that way. And it was really funny as an eye opener. And I wonder to what extent then, as you bring the sort of eye-opening quality of that conversation around Hot Rod, or just generally of like the perspective shifting capability of skateboarding, right? You see the built world in a different way. To what extent you brought that back into academia and to your like view of art history and stuff?
Yeah, I wonder. I think that I learned how to kind of deconstruct, or I had a lot of practice with like interpretation and spinning a story out of something small from my training as an art historian, particularly in graduate school. But I don't know if I really ever took skateboarding that seriously And I even thought that the kind of these critiques that like Aaron and Bobby Pulio and my other friends in New York were making those first few years, I thought that they were pretty arbitrary, because I sort of fundamentally, I mean, now I would take, like, I really want to hear what Ricky had to say, and I really want to hear, like, now I take it very, very seriously. But back then I was sort of like, maybe it was like a inferiority complex or something, where I was just like, this thing that I've devoted my life to without admitting it, this thing isn't that cool because I'm not that cool. So maybe I'm going to find something cooler in academia. And then what I can say is, after having completed a PhD in art history and taking art history very seriously, I'm like, oh, no. That thing that I started doing when I was 10 that I haven't stopped thinking about at 47, that's the thing that is actually the most important thing.
Yeah, well, it does. And I think especially at the time that you and I grew up, it opened a set of apertures for us that were really pretty transformative.
Yeah.
Which brings me to an interesting sort of, well, not, it brings me to a point. Right now you have this series on Thrasher, which is, I mean, I think truly outstanding, but also just really, truly interesting, called This Old Ledge. By the way, the like little point of trivia.
What is that?
Oh, yes,
I appreciate that.
That's a This Old House shirt, which I thought you'd appreciate. And not only I thought you'd appreciate it, but also because I found it was on eBay, and I found it because Anthony Papalardo, the writer, not the skater, or I guess they're both skaters, but Anthony Papalardo, the writer, posted it in his Substack, and he was like, there's a This Old House shirt out there. And I was just like, all right, I went and got it.
Good find.
Anyway, where did the idea for This Old Ledge come from? Is that you approaching Thrasher? Is that them going like, we want to get thinkier? Like, it's just so smart, but it's so unlikely.
It's pretty funny. I think it's a combination of a lot of things. I'd been doing spot research when I got to the Bay Area, because I had been a walking tour guide in New York, and I sort of was approaching the Bay Area during the pandemic as like designing my own walking tours of like these different spaces as I'm learning about the city. It was more a matter of just doing research. I would present some of that on my Instagram page, and on my personal Instagram pages, in these long drawn out stories, maybe on feedback, I'm not sure. And around this time, for some strange reason, my Venture Trucks gave me a signature truck, or like feedback a signature truck.
Okay.
And so we were trying to figure out what I would do for that promotion. And I mean, it's not like I'm going to film a part. I'm like, and so
I mean, compared to me, Ted, you're still ripping, but anyway,
that didn't seem like a very happy likelihood, but the team manager at the time, Zach Kovac, Stucky, the guy that dropped in on the sculpture at Embarcadero, he was like, well, why don't you just like do something? Or maybe it was Bram, who was the former team manager, but they were like, why don't you just like go skate him? We know you skate Embarcadero all the time. Why don't we like have you go down and then talk about some of the history of the skate spot? And I was like, yeah, that's a cool idea. I could do that. We could film that in a morning. And it just never happened. I couldn't get the filmer. Like the timing was just always off. I was working full time at the time, so it was very difficult to schedule it. But I think I was complaining about how slowly that was moving over drinks and dinner with my friend Tony, who is the publisher of Thrasher. And he thought about it for a little while, and then he called me back in a few weeks. I mean, I wasn't like pitching that to him, but he was just like, he's like, what about this? And he sort of said, like, This Old Ledge. And I was like, yeah, that's ridiculous. Let's do that. So,
dude, it's so awesome. And it's funny because it's like so for those who aren't familiar, you should please watch it. But This Old Ledge is a history of the built environment at key like locations in both major cities and in skateboarding history, right? The Embarcadero in San Francisco, the current series has mainly touched on New York, and particularly the sort of quadrant of downtown New York that is bordered on the north side by, let's call it, the federal courthouse, and on the south side by the Brooklyn Bridge and the plazas down there on Water Street. But you go through these like explanations of how the city's have come to life in the modern day through the lens of like how these things get used by skateboarders, and you explain how skateboarding has come to life through the use of these plazas in a way that I just think is, I mean, look, I was an urban studies major in college, so of course I'm a geek about this stuff, but it also is like, it's the sort of thing that makes very, very specific territory relatable to an audience that has nothing to do with the specificity of that territory. And I just think it's awesome. It also, you can't help but then see other things in homage to it, right? There is some series I saw on YouTube yesterday about the most famous kickflip ever. And it doesn't feel like that series, and I have no idea when it started, but it doesn't feel like that series makes any sense without somebody first giving people permission to go back and do that sort of, cultural anthropology, archaeology kind of thing.
Yeah.
Did you have any sense that it was gonna like spark people's attention the way that it seems to have? Because I see it cited constantly now.
Wait, say the last bit again. Sorry, you froze, right? Just the last sentence.
Yeah. Did you expect it to I don't know what, get people's attention and catch, like really resonate the way that it has?
No, I mean, I'm thrilled it has. I thought it would be a lot more niche than, I mean, it is pretty niche still, but I will admit that I do spend a little too much time reading the comments because I'm excited about these things and I want the dopamine or whatever.
Of course.
I don't think it's a very healthy like practice, but I'm going to work on it. But no, I was stoked. I mean, I would want to say that, of course, like On Video, that series from the turn of the last millennium, did do spot histories, and they would do it in this similar sense of like, they would, if they could, like in the Love Park one, they found out who designed it and when it was designed, and that's super important. And I think that's also what distinguishes what we do now from like the Barracks does a spot registry thing. The Dern brothers are these YouTubers, and they go around and talk about like every trick that's been done at a spot. That's super important, but it's not the story I'm telling. Like I always want to. It does take a lot of research and like time to figure out when these things got built and why they were built the way, like why they use these materials and why it looks this way. It's research that I'm attuned to doing, but I'm less interested in who did what, where, when, and more interested in why was it built and how did it become a skate spot?
Yeah.
I think the why and how questions are this type of thing. It's like, I don't want to be glib, but, or not glib, but I don't want to be dismissive, but it sort of seems like listing every trick that's been done at a spot is kind of like art history 101 when you're learning like, this style led to this, and this artist did that, and everyone did this after them. Like it's the it's the survey, the teleology, like point A to point B story. Whereas I'm more interested in like the larger structural. I'm like an upper level undergraduate course in skate spot history.
I don't know. I think you're underselling it a little bit. I think you could claim graduate school, but the one thing that I wrote, in my newsletter last week in anticipation of this conversation was that, particularly watching the one about pyramid ledges in New York, which is the plaza on Water Street in the financial district, I just had the sense, I was just like, I could imagine Ted walked into this place and talked to camera for just 5 minutes straight and just rattled this all off, just had it all. Right. And part of that, I would imagine, comes from your practice as, leading walking tours and just knowing how to keep conversation flowing and knowing what details to point out and how to hold the narrative. But I guess it feels like it is flowing out of you in such a natural way that I could almost imagine there being no work at all being done. And instead you're just receiving all of this stuff by sort of osmosis over time, which I think is kind of the ultimate compliment to give a presenter, right? It's like, it just sounds right. It feels right from the beginning. So that wasn't a question. That was just
no. Well, thank you. I mean, I can speak to the specifics of the Pyramid Ledges episode, but I think generally, like the experience of being a walking tour guide, and you have a script and you have like the hits that you want to talk about. But then someone is invariably going to ask you a question about the building across the street. And you have to, on your toes, be able to put that unknown thing into a known history that you can speak to, and whether that's sort of like deflecting it and talking about a bit larger issue and then applying it to that, or just picking out a detail and talking about where that detail comes from, using your training as an art or architectural historian to do that. If I were hard pressed, I could probably spend at least 5 minutes talking about like whatever someone pointed me. But the pyramid ledges one was really interesting because in the process of researching that, we went out to New York, and I wasn't even planning on doing pyramid ledges, but Frankie Spears picked us up from JFK. He's this guy who skates for Alien, kind of a funny Guido guy. He's awesome. And he was like, oh, you guys got to do pyramid ledges. And we realized later that he wanted us to do pyramid ledges because he had done like a kickflip backside nose blunt on pyramid ledges recently. So
okay, gotcha.
So like the first day it was raining in New York, so we couldn't film anything. So I went down and I was looking at it, and I was just like, God, this kind of, it looks like an old zoning law, like the step back skyscraper of 1915 or 1916 New York. But this is in this new space where you can build whatever you want. I wonder who designed this. And I then did research, realized it was M. Paul Freeberg, then connected him to the banks, which I hadn't done prior to that. And my mind just went, Then I realized he had designed D7 and the ledges in Battery Park and like this whole thing. Like,
oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah, and I was just like, oh my God, this is like, up until that point, because I'd only done San Francisco, I'd been so interested in Lawrence Halprin and his thing. And then I was like, oh my God, like Lawrence Halprin is a B- to M. Paul Freeberg's A+, like these are like actually great, successful urban spaces that have been celebrated and by skateboarders and non-skateboarders alike. So that one was just, it was pretty random, like I did the very minimal amount of research. I got there. It was actually an unideal time to film that episode because there was a full-on session going on. There's some guy trying to nose grind, nollie, big spin, heel flip out. Like we had already done fleshing.
I love that right there is like the perfect encapsulation of how this series brings a moment of specificity to a lay audience. Like anybody who's watching this who isn't a skateboarder is just like, oh wait, what happened to who?
Yeah.
And I know exactly what you're talking about. I've just pictured it in my head, but anyway, sorry, please go ahead.
No, totally. And there's just all these other, and I was like, it's the first time I'd been there when there were people actually skating there. And I had this self-conscious awareness that people actually know what I'm doing there because the first season had come out already.
Sure.
And so it's this whole thing. It felt kind of weird, but it came together. And the coolest thing that happened, this is so random, is after we stopped filming and Brendan, my filmer, was doing B-roll, I went over and started chopping it up with the skaters on the bench. And there's these British guys. And this one kid came up to me and he's like, you're an art historian, right? And I was like, yeah. He's like, have you heard of Jonathan Crary? And I was like, yeah, that's like one of my heroes. Like I actually took a class with him at Columbia.
And who is Jonathan Crary? Because I don't know.
He is a specialist in 19th century opticality.
Wow.
He teaches at Columbia, and he wrote a book called Techniques of the Observer, Suspensions of Perception. It's all about how like vision is a construct and how we have been conditioned to see in a certain way, and that this has come long before cinema. This came in the form of gaslights and optical devices and camera obscura and camera lucida and all these sort of things. He's also become one of the most articulate railers against social media. His most recent book, Scorched Earth, will make you throw away your iPhone. He's awesome. Right. I mean, he's truly a hero. And this was his son, and his son is a skater.
No shit. That's cool.
He's like, yeah, that's my dad. Like, and I had this like weird feeling where I was just like, oh my God, like this person actually was instrumental in getting me into graduate school. And here I am like doing this weird thing for Thrasher at this skate spot where now this guy's son is a skate photographer and a skateboarder in his own right. So I don't know. This is like stuff like that. But it kind of is also just a testament to how cool New York is. All happened around pyramid ledges.
Well, Well, yeah, but also, and this gives me a convenient segue. We talked a minute ago about the history, or you talked a minute ago about the history of Love Park, designed by Edmund Bacon, whose son famously is Kevin Bacon, who is famously the guy who's connected by 6 degrees to everybody in the universe.
Right.
I think there's something there about how skateboarding, the communities within skateboarding have had an outsized impact on culture in the last 50, 60 years, but also how it attracts people who have that kind of, let's call it broader worldview or whatever. Not everybody, of course, but in larger proportion. To that end, it getting to the theme of this show, which is like what my guests are paying attention to in the media, or what their the kind of notable stories are. I wonder what are your sources of information? Like, what are the things that you tune into and pay attention to, kind of on a regular basis?
I listen to a lot of art podcasts.
Okay.
And mostly I'm just
are any of them so sorry, let me stop you there for a second, because I just got an email from the Jerry Gagosian's podcast, which is complaints about the contemporary art scene, which I find very annoying.
I'm sure.
It's a sort of a hate listen to me. But is that like artists in conversation, or is it analysis of historical periods, or is it thematic stuff?
It's kind of contemporary. It's contemporary news, I guess, and then it'll be interviews with curators. Modern Art Notes podcast by Tyler Green is very good. The Art Angle, when Ben Davis is on it, is also very good. But as far as other things, I mean, I pay attention to all the skate videos. Like now that I'm working with Thrasher, I try to stay abreast of what's going on there. Also, anything that's on free, I read closer. That Jamie Owens' quarterly project.
Sure.
But anything that's sort of sent to me, I kind of rely on social media to see what the kids are up to. So is that what you're asking?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah. I mean, I look, part of this project for me started with trying to communicate to people the stuff that was getting my attention, whether it was stuff that I sought out or whether it was stuff that came to me exactly as you just described. And so I am always, intrigued by what other people who I find interesting are interested in, right? And that rarely means that they read as sort of Catholically as I do across many different subjects. Not that I read in a close fashion the way that you probably do, right? In terms of like real analysis, but in any case, I'm interested in the way that people consume information, and I'm also interested in those little like unseen or unspoken connections. Speaking of, like skateboard publications, Cole from A Simple Magic, which is a great newsletter, commented last week when I said we were going to do this conversation, and he's just like, yes, please. So shout out Cole, who I don't know and may never meet. Hopefully I do at some point, but it's wanting to trace the connections between things, I think is part of the reason the question. Yeah. I also asked you to take a look at a few of the stories, because this is going to be a special issue of the newsletter without a lot of the links and just interviews. What among those, what jumped out at you, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, the your piece on, I assume you wrote it. Yeah, you told me on Alexis Sablone's The Skater Gaze.
The skate gaze, yeah.
The skate gaze, yeah. I really enjoyed that, because I'm actually currently working on a show with the San Francisco Public Library about skateboarding and communities and urbanism.
Oh, wow, cool.
So Alexis Sablone is kind of like a hero. And I actually also had the opportunity to skate that plaza in Malmo.
Oh, cool.
In 2019. So that was really cool. I also have numerous people sent me that Spots video that we were talking about.
Yeah.
Or that you sent as well. And I will admit, I only watched it after you prompted me to. So put that feather in your cap. I really enjoyed it. I thought that was, I don't know. I mean, do you want to talk about either of those?
Yeah, I mean, and to bring it around, somewhat full circle, that was sent to me in response to the Pyramid Ledge episode by my son. I sent him the Pyramid Ledge episode and he sent me that back. And so it's I don't know how to explain the style of it. It feels almost arch, I think, in a way to me, like the explainerism of it. But I liked what it did in terms of saying, like, the way skateboarders use the built world is different than everybody else in ways that are less obvious than the ones that probably immediately come to mind for you. Yeah. And I liked that. And I also, it just made me think, like, all right, well, is this and partially to some extent, This Old Ledge was an inspiration for it, but it's like the people who made that, I don't know what their backgrounds are. I presume they're skateboarders, but This Old Ledge made me wonder, okay, now you guys have made this fairly adept piece of media. Can you take that level of interest to other arenas and apply it? Right. And is that how you collectively go from where you are with spots to being to or explaining skateboarding in the built world to something else? What struck you about it? Sorry, I just did a lot of talking.
I think that it's a really good primer for people who don't skate to understand how some skateboarders look at the world.
That's well said.
And I think if you're a younger skateboarder who is looking for a way to articulate what it is who wants to be taken seriously, let's just put it on an emotional level. Like, young people want adults to recognize that what they're doing is worthwhile and that it makes sense. And like I said before, like when I was describing my own teenage years, like we didn't have guides for why we skate or really good reasons. We had to sort of listen to the very inarticulate snippets that pros would say in their like 411 checkouts of like why skateboarding was important. And
I can just imagine you like quoting Jason Jesse, "I'm so into art." Like,
I mean, depends on the quote.
Well, yeah, obviously.
But so I think like 17-year-old me was gleefully watching spots, being like, yeah. And I also, 47-year-old me wants to share this with the person who I'm working with on the library show who doesn't skate, who just needs a very basic primer of like, this is how we think about the world. These are the objects and what we mean when we talk about these objects. This is what this looks like. This is what this almost feels like. But I think you're kind of right. There was this sort of arch tone, and why is this narrator like an AI British voice? And like this sort of like, there's a little bit of tongue in cheek, like here's
from somebody who is
an instructional video for the most pointless activity that is, and that's something I come up with This Old Ledge is I'm not really sure who this is for. I think if a certain type of skater only wants to hear the best tricks and gets bummed that I don't mention so-and-so's like nose grind nollie flip out at Pyramid, I know that I'm appealing to a very niche audience on some level. Maybe some people will be interested in how skateboarders talk about space who don't skate. Some will be interested in like wanting to learn what a cornice or a loggia is. And some will just, I kind of realized that this is also an extravagant statement of pointlessness, like spots, which comes down to the core issue, which is that skateboarding is like art, like everything we do, is so hard to put into words. It's so hard to describe when not doing, and so hard to present to someone who doesn't know why they should care about it, Right. And I think that's what makes it magic. But I enjoyed Spots a lot. I begrudgingly watched it because you had prompted me to, and I was pleasantly surprised.
I'm glad to hear that, dude. Well, look, I mean, anything I can turn you on to, I'm stoked about it. It's as with this whole entire exercise, right? It's all about trying to point people to stuff that I think is worth paying attention to.
Yeah, I think the existential like purpose of This Old Ledge is more to just explain how a certain spot, like why spots look and are skated the way that they are, this ledge could not have been made 150 years ago because we didn't have these resources at our disposal, or we weren't thinking in these aesthetic terms. Like modernism plays a huge role in why we skate the ledges we skate,
Sure. Well, or alternately, this particular, feature or edifice will never be built again. The ledge of granite that you cited in the courthouse ledge, it's like,
yeah,
I would imagine we just don't mine things like that anymore. Just like,
yeah. I mean, they're finite, like mineral resources. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's fascinating. So where does the show take us next? Where are you? Are you international? Are you getting even deeper? Do we know?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I think it takes so long for these episodes to come out that I guess I'm not spoiling anything if I just talk about it. But like, I'm going to LA next week, and I'm looking at what started out as 4 and is now turned into 10 spots.
Wow, cool.
And there are some carryovers from my earlier cities, New York and San Francisco, and that like some of the architects who work on some of these famous skate spots are architects who design spots that we've already talked about, or who worked with artists or who work with other architects. Some of these like large scale urban redevelopment plans that have linked like Embarcadero and the Banks also link downtown LA, like
interesting.
Like for some reason in the early 1970s, in the midst of urban blight and suburbanization, everyone's building brick plazas, with curvilinear walls and like quarter pipes. So of course. So there's stuff like that I find really interesting that people, I think, will hopefully respond to, which is just sort of thinking about, why your hometown spot looks like this other spot. Well, it might have been designed by the same guy, or they were designed under the similar circumstances, meaning like they're trying to reinvest in the center of the city, so they tear down an older blighted part of the city and build these open brick plazas, something like that. So that's where we're going. I would love to go to Europe. I would love to travel the world with this show. Knowing what I know now about how long these episodes take to come out, like I might be like in my early 50s talking about these skate spots, which, I'm not sure how I feel about, but I'm excited to try. It is, I'll admit, it is the most exciting thing that I'm doing right now. Sorry.
Well, look, you're going to be in your, no, it's okay. I was going to say, you're going to be in your early 50s talking about something. So it might as well be this.
Exactly.
And, hopefully it'll be, in many seasons to come. Because I just think it's fascinating. And I think that, the world from a skateboarding perspective has been so unexplored or underexplored in places outside of the big Western economies that you would imagine there will be lots of stories to tell elsewhere as well. Okay. Well, Ted, I should, let you go, but I do want to say that, I think, This Old Ledge is such a fascinating project. I hope you keep it going for a long time. And I hope also that those whose apertures are opened by projects like it, or like Spots, or like the Skate Gaze article that I wrote, or whatever, pursue their own means of discovery and share them back with us, because, we are constantly learning too, despite the fact that the both of us are, as you say, pushing 50 and probably should know better at this point.
Well, I think that the cool thing about skateboarding, I was listening to the Gustav Eden Beyond Boards interview yesterday, and he sort of says like, it's really not about what it is, it's about what it isn't. It's like every time that you want to define skateboarding as like, oh, it's more of an art form than a sport, or it's more of a subculture than it is a set of spatial practices, you start to realize that these categories don't really matter. And so as you get older, I think it's natural to start to ponder the ineffable and the abstract qualities and see larger patterns, and also see yourself out of those bigger patterns. So as far as I'm concerned, thinking about skateboarding, whether you're an active skateboarder or not, is a kind of lifelong pursuit, because really we're doing is we're thinking about the absolute and the infinite, and the, it's the most practical way to ponder the unanswerable questions.
Wow.
I think, right?
I mean, yeah, I mean, yes. And what a way to end. Like, where do we go from there? That's
yeah, I can deflect a direct question by being a tour guide.
Dude, I love it. Well, listen, dude, such a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks,
Thank
Ben.
you for taking the time. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And everybody, please follow This Old Ledge, follow Ted. It will teach you lots, and it will also just be endlessly sort of fascinating and entertaining. So anyway, great to see you, dude. We'll talk again soon.
All right. See you.
All right.